They say money can't buy happiness, but Sarah Mitchell was willing to bet her marriage on proving that wrong. Trading her devoted teacher husband for a charming millionaire seemed like the perfect upgrade until she discovered the dark web of lies beneath the luxury. Now, trapped in a gilded cage of her own making, Sarah must decide, is redemption worth risking everything? And what's the true price of betraying the one person who really loved you? Sarah Mitchell stood in front of her bathroom mirror, carefully applying her mascara while rehearsing the speech she'd prepared for David, her husband of 8 years. The guilt gnawed at her insides, but she'd made up her mind. Living in their modest 3-bedroom house in the suburbs, driving a 10-year-old Honda, and constantly worrying about bills had worn her down. She thought about James Preston, the charismatic real estate developer she'd met at a charity gala 3 months ago. His Tesla, his penthouse apartment, his tailored suits, everything about him sparkled with success and sophistication. When he'd kissed her in his office last week, she'd felt alive in a way she hadn't experienced in years. David was a high school history teacher, and while she'd once found his passion for education endearing, she now saw only limitation. He'd never be able to give her the life she dreamed of, the life she believed she deserved. Their recent arguments about money had only reinforced her decision. "You deserve to be happy," she whispered to her reflection, ignoring the voice in her head that reminded her of all the times David had been there for her, through her father's death, her failed art gallery venture, and the miscarriage that had nearly broken them both. That evening, as David walked through the door with his usual warm smile and a small bouquet of grocery store flowers, their Friday tradition, Sarah felt her resolve wavering. He looked tired but happy, his worn leather briefcase stuffed with student papers he would spend the weekend grading. "Hey, beautiful," he said, kissing her cheek. "I thought we could try that new Italian recipe you've been talking about. I picked up all the ingredients." Sarah's chest tightened. "David, we need to talk." The conversation that followed was both better and worse than she'd imagined. David didn't yell or make accusations. He simply sat there, listening as she explained about James, about her needs, about the life she wanted. When she finished, he looked at her with such profound sadness that she had to look away. "I hope you find what you're looking for," was all he said before walking upstairs to their bedroom. The divorce proceedings were surprisingly smooth. David didn't contest anything, agreeing to sell the house and split the proceeds. Within 2 months, Sarah had moved into James's luxurious downtown penthouse, and her old life began to feel like a distant dream. James showered her with gifts. Designer clothes, expensive jewelry, exotic vacations. She deleted her social media accounts after posting one final photo of herself on a yacht in the Mediterranean, unable to bear the judgmental comments from old friends who'd taken David's side. "You made the right choice," James would tell her, wrapping her in his strong arms. "You were meant for this life." For a while, Sarah believed him. She threw herself into the role of the perfect girlfriend, accompanying him to business dinners and charity events. She learned to navigate the complex social hierarchy of wealthy wives and girlfriends, mastering the art of subtle competition disguised as friendship. But 6 months into her new life, small cracks began to appear in the glossy facade. She noticed how James's charm could turn cold in an instant, particularly with service staff. He monitored her spending, despite his apparent wealth, questioning every purchase that wasn't pre-approved. Their conversations, once exciting and stimulating, had become superficial, revolving around money and status. One afternoon, while James was at work, Sarah discovered a hidden folder on his laptop. As a former gallery owner, she had experience with financial documents, and what she found made her blood run cold. James Preston, the successful real estate developer, was running an elaborate Ponzi scheme. His wealth was built on lies, and from what she could tell, it was all about to come crashing down. That same evening, she overheard him on the phone, speaking in harsh whispers about moving assets offshore. The man she'd thrown away her marriage for was not only a fraud, but was planning to flee the country, leaving his investors, many of whom were hard-working people who trusted him with their life savings, with nothing. Sarah lay awake that night, thinking about David and his unwavering integrity. She remembered how he would spend hours after school tutoring students who couldn't afford private lessons, how he used part of his modest salary to buy supplies for kids from struggling families. She thought about the small acts of kindness that had once seemed mundane, but now felt precious in their authenticity. Meanwhile, across town, David Mitchell was dealing with changes of his own. The sale of their house had forced him to move into a small apartment, but the change had sparked something unexpected. Looking for ways to supplement his teaching income, he had started creating educational history content online. His engaging teaching style and genuine passion for making history accessible had attracted a following. What David didn't know, what he wouldn't know for several more months, was that his side project would soon evolve into one of the most successful educational technology platforms in the country. The millions he would eventually earn were still just numbers in a future he couldn't imagine, but the seeds had been planted during the darkest period of his life. Sarah, unaware of David's growing success, found herself in an increasingly precarious position. She began gathering evidence of James's fraudulent activities, carefully documenting everything she discovered. The woman who had once chosen money over love was now faced with a moral decision that would affect hundreds of lives. One night, as she watched James charm potential investors at a rooftop party, Sarah noticed something that made her stomach turn. Among the guests was Ellen Cooper, her former next-door neighbor, a recently widowed kindergarten teacher who had mentioned investing her husband's life insurance money in a wonderful new opportunity. The weight of what she had become part of pressed down on her conscience. The luxury that surrounded her suddenly felt suffocating. The designer dress she wore might as well have been woven from lies. The diamonds at her throat felt like a collar, marking her complicity in James's scheme. But extracting herself wouldn't be simple. Over the past weeks, she'd noticed James growing increasingly paranoid. He'd installed new security cameras in the penthouse and had begun asking pointed questions about her daily activities. She suspected he knew she'd discovered something, and for the first time in their relationship, she felt afraid. Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. Should she go to the authorities? Warn the investors? The evidence she'd gathered could potentially stop James, but it could also implicate her. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice reminded her that she'd lost the right to take the moral high ground when she'd abandoned her marriage for the promise of wealth. Late one evening, Sarah sat in the penthouse's guest bathroom, her hands shaking as she texted her younger sister, Claire. It was the one place she knew wasn't monitored by James's cameras. The message was simple. I need help. Can you meet tomorrow? Don't tell anyone. Claire had been the only family member who hadn't completely cut ties with Sarah after the divorce. Though their relationship had grown strained, the sisterly bond remained intact. They arranged to meet at a small coffee shop far from James's usual haunt. The next morning, Sarah made an excuse about a spa appointment. James barely looked up from his phone, but she noticed his personal assistant watching her intently as she left. The company car that usually drove her around was mysteriously unavailable, so she took a taxi, making sure to switch cars twice before reaching her destination. Claire was already waiting when she arrived, her face etched with concern. "You look terrible, Sarah," she said bluntly, studying her sister's designer outfit and perfectly styled hair. "All that money doesn't seem to be buying much sleep." Sarah broke down, telling Claire everything: the fraud, the threats she'd overheard, the trapped feeling that had become her constant companion. Her sister listened without interruption, her expression growing darker with each revelation. "You need to go to the FBI," Claire said finally. "It's not that simple," Sarah replied, glancing nervously around the cafe. "James has connections everywhere, and..." She hesitated. "I'm not exactly innocent in all this. I've been living off this money, wearing the clothes, attending the parties. I knew something wasn't right, but I chose to ignore it." "That doesn't make you responsible for his crimes," Claire insisted. "But every day you stay silent makes you more complicit." As they talked, Sarah noticed a familiar face at a corner table. Thomas Chen, one of James's junior partners. He appeared absorbed in his laptop, but Sarah's heart began to race. Was it a coincidence, or had she been followed? She cut the meeting short, hugging Claire tightly before leaving through the back exit. Her sister's parting words echoed in her mind. "You always have a choice, Sarah. It's never too late to do the right thing." Over the next few days, Sarah noticed subtle changes in James's behavior. His usual commanding presence gave way to lengthy private phone calls and late-night meetings. She caught him shredding documents in his home office at 3 a.m., his normally steady hands trembling slightly. One evening, during a dinner party at their penthouse, Sarah overheard a conversation that chilled her to the bone. James was in his study with Victor Reeves, his longtime business partner, discussing something called Project Phoenix. "The accounts are ready in the Caymans," Victor was saying. "Once we pull the trigger, it'll be too late for anyone to stop it. But we need to act within the next 2 weeks. Sarah's mind raced. 2 weeks. That was all the time she had to prevent James from destroying countless lives. But she needed proof. concrete evidence that would stand up in court. Her phone recordings and copied documents might not be enough. Meanwhile, across the city, David's life had taken another unexpected turn. His educational platform had caught the attention of a major tech investor, leading to a series of meetings that would normally have excited him. But lately, his success felt hollow. He'd been having trouble sleeping, plagued by a nagging feeling that something wasn't right. His intuition was correct. One of his new investors, a man named Victor Reeves, had been asking strange questions about money transfers and offshore accounts. David's background in teaching hadn't prepared him for the complexities of high finance, but years of grading papers had taught him to spot when something didn't add up. What David didn't realize was that his growing success had put him directly in James Preston's crosshairs. James had identified David's expanding educational platform as the perfect vehicle for laundering money before his grand exit. The fact that it was his former wife's ex-husband's company added a twisted sense of poetic justice to the scheme. Sarah, unaware of David's involvement, was focusing on gathering more evidence. She had started volunteering at local charity events, using her position to access donor lists and financial records. The web of James's fraud was more extensive than she had initially imagined, reaching into several prominent charitable foundations. But time was running out. James had begun making comments about a surprise trip he was planning for them. Sarah knew it was likely a one-way journey to a country without extradition treaty. She needed to act fast, but one wrong move could cost her everything, possibly even her life. Late one night, as she lay awake listening to James's steady breathing beside her, Sarah's phone buzzed softly. It was a news alert about a major investment in an educational technology platform. Her heart nearly stopped when she saw David's name in the headline. As she read further, her blood ran cold. The investment was coming through one of James's shell companies. The pieces suddenly fell into place. James wasn't just planning to flee with stolen money. He was going to destroy David in the process. The man she'd left for a wealthier life was now targeting the husband she'd abandoned, using him as the final piece in his elaborate escape plan. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Sarah. Her choices had set in motion a chain of events that threatened to destroy not only her life, but also the life of the one person who had always been genuine. As she stared at the ceiling, tears silently rolling down her temple, Sarah realized that her path to redemption would require more than just exposing James. She would have to find a way to protect David without revealing her involvement. The next morning, Sarah meticulously planned her moves. She couldn't directly warn David. James had people watching her every interaction. Instead, she decided to reach out to an unlikely ally, David's best friend and fellow teacher, Michael Torres, who now served as the CFO of David's growing company. Using a burner phone purchased through a complex series of moves involving her weekly grocery deliveries, Sarah sent Michael a carefully worded message. "The Preston investment is poisoned. Protect David. Don't trust Reeves." She signed it with a reference to a practical joke from their shared past that only the three of them would know. Michael, initially skeptical, began quietly investigating the Preston connection. His background in mathematics made him particularly suited to spotting irregularities in financial patterns. What he found confirmed Sarah's warning. The investment was structured in a way that could potentially give James's company complete control over David's platform within months. Meanwhile, Sarah discovered something even more disturbing in James's private files. Hidden beneath layers of encryption was evidence that James had been tracking David's career long before Sarah had left. The entire sequence of events, from James meeting Sarah at the charity gala to the investment in David's company, had been meticulously orchestrated. Sarah felt physically ill. She'd been nothing more than a pawn in James's elaborate game. Her leaving David hadn't just been about their marriage. It had been part of James's strategy to destabilize David emotionally, making him more receptive to outside investment when the time came. The revelation forced Sarah to confront the full extent of her naivety. She'd thought she was choosing a better life, but she'd actually helped set up both herself and David for destruction. The weight of this realization was crushing, but it also sparked a fierce determination. One evening, while preparing for another charity gala, Sarah noticed James having an intense phone conversation in his study. Through the slightly ajar door, she caught fragments that made her pulse quicken. "Mitchell won't know what hit him," James was saying. "By the time the transfer is complete, we'll be long gone, and he'll be left holding the bag. The FBI will be too busy investigating him to look for us." Sarah maintained her composure through dinner, playing the role of the perfect girlfriend while her mind raced. She knew she had to act fast, but she also knew that James would be watching her every move particularly closely as his plan entered its final phase. That night, she made a decision that would change everything. Using her access to James's private servers, gained through months of careful observation and password collection, she began a massive data transfer. Every illegal transaction, every fraudulent document, every piece of evidence she'd gathered was backed up to a secure location. But James's security systems were sophisticated. The data transfer triggered a silent alarm, and Sarah's heart nearly stopped when she heard footsteps approaching the study. She quickly closed the computer and pretended to be searching for a book just as James walked in. "Having trouble sleeping, darling?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Just looking for something to read," she replied, forcing a smile. "All these business documents make great insomnia cures." He laughed, but she noticed he moved to check his computer as soon as she left the room. Sarah knew her window of opportunity was closing fast. Across town, David was in the middle of a late-night meeting with Michael and their legal team. The warning about Preston's investment had led to a deep dive into their company's financial structure. What they'd uncovered was troubling, but they needed more evidence to prove anything definitively. David couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something obvious. The investment pattern seemed familiar somehow, reminiscent of something he'd studied during his teaching days when covering the great financial scandals in history class. As he drove home that night, he passed the old house he'd shared with Sarah. The new owners had painted it a different color, but the maple tree they'd planted together still stood in the front yard. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to really think about Sarah, wondering if she'd found the happiness she'd been seeking. What he couldn't know was that at that very moment, Sarah was executing the most dangerous part of her plan. She'd discovered that James kept physical copies of his most incriminating documents in a hidden safe behind their bedroom's vintage Monet painting. A safe she'd found by accident while cleaning one day. The combination had taken weeks to crack, but Sarah had finally figured it out by carefully observing James's movement and noting the slight wear patterns on certain numbers. Now, as James slept soundly thanks to the sleeping pills she'd crushed into his evening whiskey, she stood before the safe, her hands trembling as she turned the dial. The safe opened with a soft click that sounded deafening in the quiet bedroom. Sarah held her breath, watching James's sleeping form for any sign of movement. When he remained still, she began carefully removing documents, photographing each page with a specialized camera that could capture clear images in low light. Among the papers, she found something unexpected: detailed surveillance reports on David dating back 3 years before she'd even met James. Photos of David at school, at coffee shops, even visiting his mother's grave. The level of obsession was terrifying, but it was a small black notebook that made her blood freeze. Inside were handwritten notes describing Project Lighthouse, James's original plan. He had identified David years ago as the perfect mark for his ultimate scheme. The educational platform wasn't just a convenient target. James had actually manipulated events behind the scenes to ensure its success, planning to use it as his final money laundering vehicle before disappearing. Sarah's role had been calculated from the start. James had orchestrated their meeting, knowing her growing dissatisfaction with her financial situation. He'd played on her vulnerabilities, pushing her toward the decision to leave David. It hadn't just been about adding authenticity to his cover. It was about breaking David's spirit, making him less likely to question things. When James's company swooped in with their investment offer. As she photographed the last page, Sarah heard James stir. She quickly replaced everything, closing the safe and adjusting the painting with trembling hand. By the time James's eyes fluttered open, she was sitting at her vanity, apparently removing her makeup. "Everything okay?" he mumbled, still groggy from the sleeping pills. "Just couldn't sleep," she replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I think I'll make some tea." In the kitchen, Sarah's mind worked furiously. The evidence she'd gathered was damning, but she needed a way to get it to the authorities without being traced. She also needed to warn David about the true scope of James's plan before it was too late. Meanwhile, David was making discoveries of his own. Michael's investigation had led them to a pattern of suspicious transactions involving shell companies in the Cayman Islands. But what caught David's attention was a familiar name buried in the paperwork: Claire Anderson, Sarah's sister. Claire worked as a junior analyst at one of the banks James used for his transaction. David wondered if this connection was coincidental or part of a larger pattern. Unable to sleep, he began mapping out all the connections he could think of on his classroom's old whiteboard. The sun was rising when he finally stepped back, looking at the complex web he'd created. At the center was a charity organization he'd never paid much attention to before: the Preston Foundation for Educational Innovation. The same foundation that had started supporting his online teaching initiatives shortly after Sarah left. Across the city, Sarah was implementing the next phase of her plan. She'd been secretly recording James's late-night phone conversations for weeks, capturing discussions about the planned timeline for their escape. She now knew they had less than 72 hours before James intended to trigger the final phase of his scheme. The pressure of maintaining her facade was beginning to show. That morning, as she prepared breakfast, she dropped a coffee mug, watching it shatter on the imported marble floor. James looked up from his phone, studying her with those calculating eyes. "You seem tense lately, darling," he said, his voice honey smooth, but with an underlying edge. "Perhaps you need a vacation. I've been thinking we should visit the Maldives next week. Very private. No extradition treaties." Sarah felt cold fear grip her spine, but she forced a smile. "That sounds wonderful. I'll start packing." She knew she was running out of time. James's suggestion of the Maldives wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a test. He suspected something, and he was watching her reaction carefully. The next 3 days would determine not just her fate, but the fate of everyone touched by James's elaborate scheme. As she cleaned up the broken mug, Sarah's hand brushed against her engagement ring from James, a flawless 5-carat diamond that suddenly felt more like a shackle than a symbol of love. She thought about her simple gold band from David, the one she'd left behind on their bedroom dresser the day she walked out. She'd traded authentic happiness for a gilded cage, and now she had to find a way to make things right before it was too late. That afternoon, while James was in a board meeting, Sarah received an unexpected text from an unknown number. "We need to talk about David and James. Coffee shop on 4th, 1 hour." It was signed simply M. Sarah stared at the message, her mind racing. M could only be Michael Torres, but meeting him would be incredibly risky. James had people watching her constantly. Yet, this might be her only chance to protect David from what was coming. Sarah decided to take the risk. Using her regular spa appointment as cover, she managed to shake her tail through a series of calculated moves involving multiple taxi changes and a brief stop in a department store where she bought and changed into different clothes. The coffee shop was busy, perfect for a discreet meeting. Michael sat in a corner booth, his laptop open like any other remote worker. Sarah slid into the seat across from him, her heart pounding. "Does David know you're meeting me?" she asked immediately. "No," Michael replied, his expression grim. "And it needs to stay that way for now. We've discovered something that changes everything." He turned his laptop to show her a complex financial diagram. At its center was a familiar name, Anderson Global Holding, her father's old company, now defunct after his death 5 years ago. "James didn't just target David's company," Michael explained quietly. "He's been working this angle for years. Your father's company, its collapse, the insurance policy that kept your family afloat. It was all engineered by James." Sarah felt the room spin. Her father's death had been attributed to stress from his company's sudden financial troubles. She'd blamed herself for years, thinking her failed art gallery had contributed to his burdens. "The gallery," she whispered, the pieces clicking into place. "The loan that fell through at the last minute." Michael nodded grimly. "James's fingerprints are all over it. He's been orchestrating every major financial event in both your and David's lives for the past decade." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She hadn't just been a pawn in James's recent schemes. Her entire life had been manipulated by him. Every hardship, every setback that had led her to doubt her marriage to David had been carefully planned. "There's more," Michael continued, sliding a USB drive across the table. "David's platform isn't just a money laundering vehicle. James is using it to gather sensitive financial data from schools and educational institutions across the country. Once he has what he needs, he'll frame David for everything," Sarah finished, feeling sick. "The financial fraud, the data theft, all of it." As they talked, Sarah noticed a woman at the counter who'd been there too long without ordering. Her instincts, honed by months of paranoia, kicked in. "We're being watched," she muttered to Michael. "Give me your phone." She quickly typed out additional instructions, then stood up casually, as if their meeting was ending. "Check the drive immediately," she said under her breath. "But don't let David access it yet. There's a failsafe we need to disable first." Back at the penthouse, Sarah found James waiting for her. He sat in his leather armchair, swirling a glass of scotch, his expression unreadable. "How was your spa day, darling?" he asked, his voice too casual. "Refreshing," she replied, maintaining her composure. "Though I think I'm coming down with something. My stomach's been off." James smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's unfortunate, especially since we're having guests for dinner. The Reeves are coming over, and Victor's bringing a special guest." He paused meaningfully. "Your old friend David Mitchell." Sarah's carefully constructed facade nearly cracked. James was accelerating his timeline. Whatever he had planned for David was happening tonight. Meanwhile, David sat in his office, staring at an invitation that had just arrived by courier. Dinner at the Preston penthouse. His first instinct was to decline, but something about the timing nagged at him. The investment deal was reaching a critical phase, and he'd learned enough about James Preston to know the man never did anything without multiple motives. As he considered his response, an alert popped up on his computer. Someone was trying to access his platform's secure servers from an unauthorized location. The IP address traced back to a high-rise downtown, the same building where he'd be having dinner in a few hours. Across town, Sarah paced in her walk-in closet, supposedly choosing an outfit for dinner. In reality, she was making frantic calculations. The evidence she'd gathered was encrypted and set to automatically upload to multiple news outlets and law enforcement agencies if she didn't enter a code every 12 hours. The next deadline was during dinner. She had a choice to make: release the evidence now and warn David, possibly putting him in immediate danger from James's contingency plans, or wait and try to protect him at dinner, risking that James's scheme might succeed. Sarah chose a third option. She carefully typed out a series of delayed commands that would release the evidence in stages, starting with the least damaging information. It would serve as a warning shot across James's bow without revealing her full hand. As she dressed for dinner, selecting a deep blue evening gown that James had bought her, she thought about the small glass vial in her clutch. Claire had given it to her during their last meeting, a clear, undetectable liquid that would cause severe but temporary stomach distress. Just in case, her sister had said. The dinner table was set with James's finest china, crystal glasses catching the light from the elaborate chandelier above. Sarah watched as their guests arrived: Victor and his wife, Amanda Reeves, 2 junior partners from the firm, and finally, David. Seeing him again after all these months made her heart stutter. He'd lost weight, and there was a new intensity in his eyes, but he carried himself with quiet confidence. She noticed he wasn't wearing his wedding ring anymore. "Mr. Mitchell," James said warmly, extending his hand. "So glad you could join us. I believe you know my girlfriend, Sarah." David's eyes met hers briefly, his expression carefully neutral. "Yes, we've met." The first course arrived. James's chef had prepared an elaborate tasting menu. Sarah watched as James orchestrated the conversation, skillfully directing it toward business. She knew he was setting up something, but she couldn't warn David without exposing herself. "Your educational platform is revolutionary," James was saying. "The way it handles student data is particularly impressive. In fact, we've been looking into expanding its capabilities." Sarah saw the trap being laid. James was going to trick David into revealing sensitive information about his system's security protocols. She needed to act fast. Rising gracefully, she lifted her wine glass. "A toast," she announced, buying herself precious seconds as everyone turned to her. "To new partnerships." As glasses clinked, she deliberately stumbled slightly, her hand brushing James's glass. The clear liquid from her vial mixed with his wine, unnoticed by anyone. The dinner proceeded according to James's careful choreography until halfway through the main course, when he suddenly excused himself, looking distinctly unwell. Victor Reeves followed him, concern etched on his face. In their absence, Sarah noticed David studying her intently. He'd barely touched his food, and she suspected he'd noticed more than he let on. Their eyes met across the table, and for a moment, the years fell away. She saw understanding dawn in his expression. He knew she was involved in whatever was happening. Before either could speak, James returned, his face pale, but his eyes burning with barely concealed rage. He'd received an urgent message on his phone. The first wave of evidence had just been leaked to a major financial newspaper. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice tight, "I apologize, but we'll have to cut the evening short. An urgent business matter requires my immediate attention." As the guests began to leave, James gripped Sarah's arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "My office. Now," he hissed in her ear. But before he could drag her away, David stepped forward. "Actually, Mr. Preston, I had some concerns about the security protocols we discussed earlier. Perhaps we could clarify those points now." James hesitated, trapped by the need to maintain his facade. Sarah felt his grip loosen slightly. In that moment, she saw something that chilled her to the bone. James's other hand was moving toward the inside of his jacket, where she knew he kept a small handgun. Time seemed to slow down. Sarah could see multiple futures branching out from this moment. James exposing the gun, David getting hurt, everything spiraling into violence. She had seconds to make a decision that would affect not just her life, but everyone. Sarah deliberately knocked over her wine glass, the red liquid spreading across the pristine white tablecloth. The sudden movement startled James, his hand freezing halfway to his jacket. In the ensuing commotion of servants rushing to clean the spill, Sarah managed to position herself between James and David. "I'm so sorry, darling," she gushed, playing up her embarrassment. "I'm feeling rather faint. Perhaps we should reschedule the security discussion." James's eyes narrowed, but with witnesses present, he had to maintain his composed facade. "Of course, my dear. Mr. Mitchell, shall we say tomorrow morning at my office, 9 a.m.? David nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. Actually, I have a better idea. Why don't we meet at my company's headquarters? I can give you a tour of our security infrastructure firsthand. It was a clever countermove. James couldn't refuse without appearing suspicious, but meeting on David's territory would severely limit his options for whatever he had planned. Perfect, James replied, his smile not reaching his eyes. As the last guests filed out, he turned to Sarah. Clean yourself up and meet me in my study. We need to talk about your clumsiness. The moment James left the room, Sarah slipped a small note into David's coat pocket as he retrieved it from the butler. She'd prepared it earlier, knowing she might only get one chance. The note contained a single word: tomorrow. Alone in the bathroom, Sarah's hands shook as she texted Claire. Initiate Protocol B. It was their predetermined signal. Claire would now release the second wave of evidence, documents proving James's involvement in their father's company's collapse. She could hear James pacing in his study, making angry phone calls. The first leak had clearly rattled him, but she knew it wouldn't be enough to stop him. He had contingency plans within contingency plans. Her phone buzzed with an incoming text from an unknown number. Whatever you're planning, be careful. He's not alone in this. It was from Michael, who must have been monitoring the situation from afar. Sarah stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, remembering another moment like this, months ago, when she'd convinced herself that leaving David was the right choice. How blind she'd been. But regret wouldn't help her now. She needed to focus on preventing James from destroying both her ex-husband and dozens of innocent investors. In his study, James was rapidly unraveling. She could hear him shouting into his phone, "I don't care what it takes. Find the leak and plug it, and move everything forward to tomorrow. After the Mitchell meeting, we go dark." Sarah's heart raced. James was accelerating his plan. Whatever he intended to do at tomorrow's meeting, it would be the endgame. She thought about the gun he carried, about the cold look in his eyes when things didn't go his way. Meanwhile, David sat in his car outside the building, his hand clutching the note Sarah had slipped him. His phone lit up with a message from Michael. "You were right about everything, but there's more. Check your email." The attached files confirmed what David had begun to suspect. James Preston's obsession with him went far beyond simple financial fraud. The man had been systematically dismantling and rebuilding both his and Sarah's lives for years, moving them like pieces on a chessboard. As midnight approached, three people in different parts of the city prepared for what would be the most important day of their lives. Sarah, in her gilded cage high above the city, carefully encoded the final piece of evidence that would expose everything. David, in his modest apartment, studied financial records that revealed the true scope of James's manipulation. And James, in his study, loaded his gun and made one final call to a number that would never be traced. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change all their lives forever. But as Sarah lay awake in bed beside the man she'd once thought was her salvation, she realized that the next 24 hours would determine not just their fates, but the very nature of justice and redemption. Dawn broke over the city, painting the penthouse windows in shades of gold. Sarah hadn't slept, her mind racing with contingency plans. James had left the bed hours ago, locked in his study making preparations for what he called the final phase. At 8:30 a.m., Sarah sent her last text to Claire. Release everything. Within minutes, news sites across the country began publishing detailed exposés of James Preston's criminal empire. Bank records, surveillance photos, insider testimony. The evidence was overwhelming and impossible to contain. James burst into the bedroom, his usual polished appearance disheveled. "What did you do?" he snarled, waving his phone. "The Singapore accounts are frozen. Everything's falling apart." "It's over, James," Sarah said calmly, standing her ground. "I know everything. About my father's company, about how you engineered my failed gallery, about your obsession with David. All of it." His laugh was hollow. "You think you've won? I still have one card to play. Mitchell's meeting is in 20 minutes. By the time it's over, he'll be facing federal charges for everything I've done. The evidence is already planted." "No, it's not," came a voice from the doorway. David stood there with Michael and several FBI agents. "We swept the offices last night, found all your little presents, the doctored servers, the fake transaction records, even the offshore account documents you planned to discover during our meeting." James reached for his gun, but Sarah was faster. She knocked his arm aside just as he drew it, sending the weapon skittering across the marble floor. The FBI agents swarmed in, taking him down as he screamed threats and accusation. As James was led away in handcuffs, Sarah faced David for the first time, without pretense between them. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly, "for everything." David's expression softened. "I know. Michael showed me all the evidence you gathered. You risked everything to make this right. Not everything, Sarah replied. I lost the most important thing long before any of this happened. The day I decided money was more important than love. In the weeks that followed, James's empire crumbled completely. The evidence Sarah had gathered led to dozens of arrests and the recovery of millions in stolen funds. David's educational platform was cleared of any wrongdoing, and its genuine success continued to grow. Sarah testified against James, helping to ensure he received a lengthy prison sentence. She moved into a modest apartment, took a job at a small community art gallery, and began the slow process of rebuilding her life, this time on a foundation of authenticity rather than materialism. 1 year later, Sarah sat on a park bench, watching children play. A familiar figure sat down beside her. "The gallery's doing well," David said. "Claire mentioned you've been running some art programs for underprivileged kids." Sarah nodded. "It feels good to create something real, something that actually helps people." They sat in comfortable silence for a while before David spoke again. "You know, someone once told me that it's never too late to do the right thing." Sarah smiled, remembering Claire's words from what felt like a lifetime ago, that someone was right. "Would you like to get coffee sometime?" David asked. "Just coffee," he added with a small smile. "No hidden agendas, no pretenses." Sarah looked at him, seeing the same kindness in his eyes that she'd once taken for granted. "I'd like that," she replied softly. As they walked together through the park, Sarah realized that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars or luxury goods. It was measured in integrity, in the courage to admit mistakes, and in the strength to rebuild what was broken. She had lost everything to learn this lesson, but in losing it all, she had finally found something real, the possibility of redemption and perhaps a second chance at genuine love. The setting sun cast long shadows across the path before them, but for the first time in years, Sarah wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. She had learned the hard way that life's greatest riches couldn't be bought with any amount of money. They had to be earned through honesty, courage, and the wisdom to recognize true value you find it.